Good morning. Welcome to this California Air Resources Board informal workshop related to the Cap and Trade program. Thank you for joining. I'm going to give just a few more seconds to ensure the audience has fully arrived electronically. I want to start by introducing our interpreter, Aldo. We want to let attendees know that this meeting is being interpreted into Spanish. To access interpretation services, click the globe interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and select Spanish. To only hear the Spanish interpretation and not the original audio, select Mute Original Audio in the interpretation menu. Select English in the interpretation menu to enable hearing simultaneous English interpretation of any comments provided in Spanish. If you're listening in English, do not select Mute Original Audio. So Aldo will now give instructions in Spanish to the entire audience before moving to the Spanish audio channel.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Muy buenos días a todos ustedes. Esta reunión va a proporcionar servicios de interpretación. Si es tan amable, puede hacer clic en el icono de interpretación en la parte inferior de su pantalla, en donde se encuentra la barra de herramientas en la parte inferior. Seleccione español. Una vez que lo haga, también favor de seleccionar nuevamente el mismo botón y va a presionar silenciar el audio original para escuchar solo la interpretación en español y no el lenguaje en el idioma original. Además de eso, si tiene usted alguna pregunta o problemas técnicos, favor de alzar su mano o escribirlo en el chat y con mucho gusto lo apoyaremos. Muchísimas gracias por participar. Mark, back to you. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Aldo. And so again, Cap and Trade program, informal workshop on pre-rulemaking activities. You're likely aware that the Cap and Trade program is part of California's three-pronged approach to regulations, incentives, and carbon pricing to achieve the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. It's a mature and effective program. It's been in place since 2012. And over that time, it's supported a steadily increasing price signal for investment in clean technologies across all major sectors of the economy. As part of California's portfolio of climate policies, it's worked together with other regulations and incentives to achieve the state's 2020 emissions reduction target early. Anytime the program is updated, that's done through thoughtful planning and public engagement. We're currently in an informal pre-rulemaking phase where we discuss initial concepts and invite feedback to inform the process. Last year, Cap and Trade program staff held 4 public workshops, 2 jointly with our linkage partners in Quebec, to share initial thinking on potential program updates. Today's workshop continues that series of informal discussions of initial concepts related to rules of the market and offset credits. We know we will be increasing the stringency of the program by removing some allowances from circulation. That was discussed in previous workshops. With respect to the market rules today, this discussion is about doing our due diligence to review and understand potential market impacts from a more stringent program. We want to continue to promote a well-functioning market that offers liquidity and transparent pricing, and that supports the ability of entities to comply in the most effective manner. It's important to note that individual concepts should not be considered in isolation, but rather all together and in the context of a more stringent program. A couple weeks ago, CARB released a standardized regulatory impact assessment, or SRIA, which is posted to our webpage. This is not a formal proposal, but an initial and conservative estimate of potential costs and benefits based on early information that was available at the time of the assessment. Long term, our goal is to complete the full rulemaking process as soon as possible to provide near-term certainty for a tightening program, for investments, and for the use of federal incentives that are currently available. I'll note that all changes are being considered in close coordination with our colleagues in Quebec, and any changes will be considered holistically in a manner that maintains that existing linkage. To that end, Kim Ricard from Quebec's cap and trade system is joining us today, and I'd like to briefly introduce her and have her say a few words.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to join you today for this workshop. So we have initiated a similar process in Quebec to assess the operating parameters of our cap and trade system in order to contribute to achieving our GHG emission reduction target by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. As Mark mentioned, as part of this initiative, we have been collaborating closely with our partner, California, to remain effective, and namely to evaluate potential market control mechanism adjustment that may be made to our respective regulations. I also want to thank the teams in California and Quebec for all the work they do every day to run the joint market, and I look forward to the next phases. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim, and would like to echo her sentiments related to the CARB staff work. It's a tremendous amount of effort for the entire process, including workshops like these, so thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Camille Sultana, who's been doing lots of work as the lead program staff and working on the amendment process, and she'll present some of the introductory information for the workshop today. So Camille, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. And before there we go. So a few more workshop logistics before we get started. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted to the Cap and Trade Meetings and Workshops page, where you can find material for today's workshop and a link to CARB's public comment docket. The deadline to submit written feedback is May 8th. We'll start this morning with a short presentation from an invited speaker from the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. CARB staff will then present a brief overview of the potential changes to the cap and trade program, focusing on the scenario in the recently released SRIA. We will follow with a market rules discussion and a public comment period. After a brief break, staff will present on compliance offset program topics, followed by a second public comment period. I'll now introduce our invited speaker, Kevin Hamilton from the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. Kevin Hamilton is the Senior Director of Government Affairs at the Central California Asthma Collaborative. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, took me a minute to get myself organized there. Thank you for this invitation today. Honored to be able to present at this workshop on this project that has been so meaningful both to California and I think the rest of the world in many ways, as we endeavor to chart our pathway to a new and carbon-free future. Over the years, we've looked at this program, I think, through several different lenses. One has been primarily how much carbon can we get out of what we do every day and how quickly. And the other one is how can we do that and do no harm at the same time, where the harm from the warming of our planet is somehow outstripped by harm that we're leaving in our communities, that we're doing to the communities that live adjacent to the major emitters of this particular gas. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'm assuming CARB staff's going to control the slides. So historically, we go back to 2016. Some of us were working on the 2017 scoping plan update on the EJAC at that time, and we were thinking this is 10 years out on the legislation. Where are we? And so CARB's graphics team did, a lot better than they had in the past, new tools through PowerPoint, and we got to see this in sort of a little better perspective, using all the tools at our beck and call at that time. So we note that transportation, no surprise, sits high on the list as our major player in carbon emissions, with our industrial sector right behind it, and then various types of electricity. But let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And then fast forward to 2021, where we see nothing's changed. We have a better resolution of what's inside those big bars now. And we start to note sort of who are the biggest actors in all of this. Where's all this carbon coming from? So the resolution here makes it so much easier, most of us thought and think, to be able to target our funding, our money that we have to put into this. And you can see right off the bat that there's these really big players like passenger vehicles and in-state generation of electricity, heavy-duty vehicles, refineries, livestock, and of course, residential. And why do we point those out? Well, because they're in our state. So there are things that are outside of our control that are coming into our state, are much more difficult to control. Energy has that feature, but this is in-state generation that's a big player here. And so the vehicles that are here, we have control of that. We can do something about that. So they are the biggest sources. So they should get most of whatever funding is necessary to help them come into compliance, right? I mean, that would make sense. We shouldn't waffle about that. And indeed, the legislation was set up to create that kind of carve out where certain percentages of the cap and trade funding would go to these different categories first, and they're allocated there. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I had fun with graphics too. And looking back, though, I wanted to see, so what have we done since then? What have we accomplished? What's the mission was 2020, we're going to be at a certain spot. And at the last minute, the very last minute, we hit it. We knew we would hit it because there were a couple of things coming in play that would let us, but we finally made it. But did we really? So when I look at this slide, when I took the trouble to take apart the actual data and then reform it into this graph, I thought to myself, transportation should be, bearing the brunt of this, but I'm just not seeing the kind of changes, incremental changes of 1%, 2%. This is across a 14-year timeline. Now, granted, these things are difficult, but I really felt a little let down. And in a minute, you'll see why. Next slide. So then I thought, well, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and let's move to when cap and trade actually started and we really had some money. Because let's face it, in the beginning, this was a dream, lots of legislation, lots of promises, lots of attempts to carve our already well-carved California budget. But now we have money, we're going to start investing that money, and let's see if in that shorter term, still not a lot going on there. Well, we did make it, we started a downward trend. I guess we'll look at that way. And transportation definitely carrying the heavy load here. We're seeing a little bit of improvement from the electric side, not much really. Pretty much agriculture and Our friends over at the recycling areas and industrial, pretty flat line. So let's go ahead on to the next slide. Not really excited about this. Whoa, cap and trade. What does it really do? It provides money. Well, how does it provide that money? Just so you know, the EJAC actually pays attention to these things. We know about carbon auctions. You'd be surprised the things that we know at EJAC. And we know that there's 4 of these every year. And some of us were even there when the auction took a dive back there in 2017 and everybody thought the sky was falling. And of course it wasn't, just was a little bit of a reset there. And off we went again. And here we see the division of the funds, investor-owned utilities. IOUs do very well from cap and trade. Interestingly enough, they get a lot of money, but still ratepayers are burdened with different fees to augment that existing money. Odd, funny money, right? And then publicly owned utilities, there's more of them, of course, a lot of them all over the place who are kind of left on their own to divide up this much smaller pie. And then the California legislature gets to play. If they don't like what the original legislation required they do as a carve up, they can dive in and carve up a little bit more. And they do. And they are in this session, interestingly enough, making those changes. Next slide, please. But how much? How much really are we talking about here? Well, so far we've taken in a total of about $45 billion. It's a big number. It's a really big number. I did a little math. That's like 90,000 $500,000 electric trucks. So it's more like 900,000 cars. So that money has already been in and is running and is being spent. Maybe just this last allocation hasn't been, but I'm sure in the minds of our friends at the legislature and the IOUs and utilities it has. So here's where we are, $45 billion in, and we've dipped the needle barely 10%, 12. Okay, I'll be nice. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? Who's paying for this? Where's all this money going? I mean, I just don't understand it. So we're still giving free allowances, free carbon allowances to industry, utilities, carbon offsets to private projects. So, you know, you can still pollute and we'll give you some more credits here. You know, all of these things are still happening. And we need to start thinking about, what about these big players? Is this really working with them? How are we measuring the impact of this? Are we just looking at this graphic and saying to ourselves, yeah, the carbon's going down over here. We're going to make it to 2045. Well, we are not going to make 2045 on that pathway that we're on. And I appreciate that this is the first scoping plan where we can really say we have the potential for a reset. The SREA looks like it does. I mean, we've only had it for less than a week, and most of us have jobs and don't have time. And it's not just the SREA. So haven't had a really good chance to look at it and hope to learn more today. But we see that those prices are borne by pretty much everybody. But I would argue, and we would all argue, that the highest amount of impact that's happening is happening in the communities adjacent to companies that emit more than 25,000 tons of CO2, megatons of CO2 per year. And that these energy prices that we're looking at are killing our people economically. Next slide, please. So as we know, these costs are kind of distributed around from place to place so that theoretically the costs are diluted so that one group doesn't end up with all of that expense on them. But I do want to everybody to understand and make it clear that when we're looking at the cost of electricity, the cost of natural gas, the cost of transportation fuels, again, it's the lower 40% of Californians, and I do say 40% intentionally, because 40% of Californians are living at or below 150% of the federal poverty line. So they are bearing this cost directly, and they are not getting relief from this cost. And so we need to remove those free allocations. We need more rebates and more revenue there. We need to change that offset policy, and we need to target our GGRF spending more effectively and rebate those GGRF funds back to our communities. Next slide, please. So is there another way? I thought this was so interesting. Been a long time since I thought or looked at this, but is anybody doing this differently? Is there something else we can look at? So forgive me, CARB staff, but I couldn't resist. Next slide, please. Look back at this auction that made us all stress out. And here we were, and suddenly at the top where it's normally Quebec and California, because very few other people would, dip into this insanity, Ontario joined. And Ontario is near and dear to my heart. I'm from Ohio. It's right across the lake from me, Lake Erie. You can almost see it at night when the lights of Toledo are on. Big industrial city there, lots of steel mills, lots of carbon, big auto manufacturing center. And so they joined for a minute. Next slide, please. But then they left. And so Canada created a carbon tax. They decided to go with the tax and dividend model. So we've all thought all along, we've got to do this. We've got to do this cap and trade thing, right? I mean, there's really no other way. The rest of the world is looking at us. Washington State has stepped up, and said, we're cool. It's our West Coast buddy. They do a lot of things that we do and support us in our air pollution cleanup plans and adopt a lot of our programs as their own. It's cool. I would say, at this point, probably half of Washington came from California originally anyway. They would argue that. But here we are in Canada, and Ontario lasted about one cycle in the cap and trade plan, and it too was just abdicated and said, nah, we're going to go back to this plan that rebates that money directly to the people who are suffering the most from it. And, these charges that they put on fuel and on carbon, you would think that would have driven industry out of Canada, but actually their industry is thriving. Their farms are thriving. Indigenous groups have autonomy and benefit from this funding. And so it may not look like a lot of money, but in fact, in 8 out of 10 households, as it said, they get more money back than they spend on fuel. So I know a lot of people who would feel pretty good about getting that check every 3 months, I can tell you that. But I know we're pretty far down the road here, so it's unlikely we can turn this particular train around. But I always think it's good for us to understand that this way is not the only way. Now, what if we were to take this piece and look at the folks who are trading our credits up and down, back and forth, but aren't really moving very well on the take down my carbon sign path? So maybe we better think about some of them, and do they really get to keep enjoying the benefits of our beautiful cap and trade program, or should we spin that around and make sure that they get regulated and that they pay for that carbon that they're emitting, and that payment be distributed to the communities where the pollution from that carbon and the impacts from that industry are highest? I don't know. Just seems like it might be fair, but I'm just on the EJAC. I don't know. It's the respiratory therapist over here doing his job. Next slide, please. So things that EJAC feels that we can do. We feel that we can build a better way together here. And we think that if we were eliminating, and all the smart people over there at the Senate and IMEAC and others that are paid to consult on this, that don't have a dog in the fight other than it's their planet too, have told us that it really doesn't make sense to be doing this anymore. And the idea that it's going to prevent leakage is based on old data, and we really haven't seen that in the newer data. So why are we still doing that? Now, I haven't read enough of the SRIA to know whether or not this is actually going to change, so I'm going to withhold judgment here. But we need to revise this framework under which these industrial polluters are allocated free allowances to account for the technical analysis of leakage risk conducted in earlier rulemakings in the program. In other words, let's compare the answers that we got from the poor information that we had to build a formula back then, and let's use the tech we had today. I mean, you notice the difference between that kind of junky slide from 2016 and the cool one in 2021, and apply that new math and that new information, and let's make sure that this is actually working. In 2017, the argument was, well, it hasn't been long enough. It hasn't been long enough. I watched somebody so emotional that they came to tears over this. I felt terrible about what I was pushing them to shut down because they had so much invested in it and really believed in it. Okay, that's fine. So now we're 15, 16 years out. When do we change? Where is that point? How much time do we really have? My understanding is we don't got a lot of time. We want to get under 1.5, and we're almost there. We're at 1.2, whatever. I mean, these aren't clocks we can turn back easily, if ever. Or if they do turn back, it's going to be hundreds of years. So let's move on to the next slide. Eliminate offsets. Again, this comes right out of the air pollution world, right? This whole idea of offsets, and it just needs to end. I mean, the idea is it needs to end. It's old news. It's a hangover from the 70s, and it needs to go. It came across into cap and trade from air pollution, and it's created nothing but nightmares for all of us along the way. So location matters, and the disproportionate health impacts from the co-pollutants exposure in EJ communities is not being addressed by out-of-state offsets. That's just shifting it somewhere else. That's like mitigating air pollution through ERCs, where the pollution happens in my world in the San Joaquin Valley in Bakersfield, but we're going to fix something up in San Joaquin County, 220 miles away. That's not going to help those people in Bakersfield. That air pollution will still be there, and it's the same with this. And it's just got to go. And again, the idea that we're taking it on from countries where governments are shifting rapidly, and that's a terrible thing for them to have to live under, but from the idea that we're building contracts and providing funding for governments like that through these programs is abhorrent to me. Next slide, please. And it should be to you. So last two from EJAC, we're pretty simple. 4 things that we think are really important. I've mentioned it before, but the legislature wanted to know more. They hired their own experts who were independent. Something that we could probably take a picture from, not necessarily coming out of our lovely UCs in California, but looking a little wider. And it's telling us we need to do these things. It's telling the legislature they need to do these things. Now, CARB can do a lot of these things or wait for the legislature to act. I would argue, for me, I'm not a waiting kind of person. So if I have the ability to do it, I'm more prone to get up and do it. So let's get up and do it. And then this trading thing that's happening in the communities that we live in, that I live in, this has just got to stop. We need to restrict and create boundaries where regulation has got to be the way. Nothing has moved this needle faster than regulation. The Canadians expect from their program to see about 1/3 of the carbon they need to have reduced by 2030, reduced through their model. Our model will not get us 1/3 of the carbon that we need to have reduced by 2030. It doesn't even look like it'll get that much, 1/3 of all the carbon we need reduced by 2045. So, you know, I always like to have the best if I can get it, and this is just not it. Next slide, please. So why do we do all this? People wonder, you know, why is the EJAC involved? Why do we stand on the podium and pound our fist and say things that are often not done, even though they're prophetic? If you look at the EJAC recommendations from 2017, you will find that most of them were spot on, and the warnings, because we're actually smart people too. Next slide, please. Because we see this happening in our communities. The health impacts of this problem. As somebody who's a clinician, I see these things every day. I see the heat-related illness. I see the mental health impacts of this economy, of the industries that are being driven out by this heat. As we see water start to fade away from places it was always there. As we see high heat days that are lasting days longer than they ever did before. High temperatures that are rivaling those of Death Valley 20 years ago. When I heard that we were sitting here at 116, 118 degrees or 17 degrees one day in the San Joaquin, I remember when that was a record in Death Valley. Now Death Valley's pushing up on 130. Is this really working? I mean, I know it's slow. I got a degree in geology. I know it's slow. The earth is slow. It's hard to rebound, but this is not the earth. This is us doing something to the earth and creating a change in the actual overall earth environment. And that change is slowly but clearly killing us. And so the earth doesn't care. You know, it's one thing I learned from that is the earth doesn't care. The earth will be here the next day. And whatever's on it will be there too, and it probably won't care either. But I care, and I think everybody else here cares, or you wouldn't be sitting here today. So let's really think about this. I did a presentation for Kaiser Foundation about 6-7 years ago, and they wanted me to talk about medical issues related to climate change. And I called out that we were going to see diseases here in this country that we didn't see before, that were tropical in nature and that we weren't used to having. And what do you know? People laughed, actually, and some people thought I was crazy. But in fact, they're here. We're already seeing these things that we never thought we'd see in the United States again. The vectors that bring them now have a pathway because of the environment. They can fly there. They can ride a ship there. They can come here on a ship and bring it with them. So normally it would have died when it got here because it couldn't survive in our environment. But now the environment's shifting to the point where it can. Florida, Southern California, the southern part of the United States, all seeing these new diseases. Stunned by them, in fact. So anyway, moving on. Last slide, please. So a second ago, I said, why are we all here? Why do we do this? And I believe that everybody in this room and everybody that I work with and know is here for these 3 reasons: for our families, for our planet, and most of all, we do this because it's the right thing to do. So let's do the right thing today and make sure that we're thinking about all of these things that I've just talked about as we adjudicate our climate's future, our country's, our planet's future, and do the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate you joining us this morning and going through the slides. And for everyone that's on here, we will post Kevin's slides on our website. so that you have access to them. There's a couple of points that I think I just want to clarify here. Since I was here when Ontario joined and then dropped out of the cap and trade linked program, when Doug Ford came into office during the time Ontario was in the cap and trade program with California and Quebec, he actually came in on a platform that was an anti-climate platform. And today they do have a carbon tax, but that is because they have a national carbon tax. And if at a provincial level you don't have a program of your own like Quebec does, you default into a carbon tax. And so that wasn't an active decision that the government made in Ontario. They defaulted into it because they gave up being part of that linked program, but came in on an anti-climate platform. I also want to clarify that there are no international forest offsets in the program. I know that there's a misconception out there, but I feel like I just need to clarify that. On the point about the three asks, which came up, no allowances, no offsets, and limited trading, and especially no trading in disadvantaged communities. We got that feedback when Martha Dina presented at the community workshops. And because we got early feedback, we were able to reflect some discussion around all three of those in the SRIA. So I know, Kevin, you haven't read it, but we do have text in there that took into account that feedback that we got early on. And we did do some thinking about it as we were thinking about putting the SRIA together. And on your point about why are we doing this, couldn't agree more on those 3 points that you had. But we also know that California alone can't do it. And so we need a lot of partners to come with us. And to the extent that you, Kevin, and other members of the EJAC are speaking, whether it's within California or in front of other governments or with other coalitions across the US or internationally, I think we all have a role to play as an ambassador to help push people to do as much as they can everywhere to reduce greenhouse gases. And so with that, I want to turn it back over to the staff for the staff presentation. And I think that comes back to you, Camille. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. And we'll now move on to staff presentation. And so we'll start with, we'll start with a brief overview of the potential changes to the cap and trade program. At the highest level, California's climate policies, like cap and trade, are determined by state legislation and executive orders. These statutes and directives establish both statewide greenhouse gas targets or sector-specific goals, which inform CARB's climate change scoping plan and individual policies and regulations. Since the adoption of the first scoping plan in 2008, carbon pricing in the form of a cap and trade program has been part of California's successful portfolio approach to achieving the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. And it will remain critical as we work toward economy-wide decarbonization. The process to update the program is being informed by AB 1279, which established the state goals of reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by 85% below 1990 levels and achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. The 2022 scoping plan update, which indicated the need to increase 2030 emissions reductions from the SB 32 target to support achievement of the 2045 climate targets. An updated AB 32 greenhouse gas emission inventory. The inventory published in 2022 included an adjustment to align emissions from all sectors with third-party verified data. And staff are continuing to assess updates based on implementation needs and ongoing experience. CARB held 4 workshops and 2 community meetings in 2023 to develop concepts aligned with these state goals. Over the past year, informed by engagement with stakeholders and the public through the pre-rulemaking process, staff have developed initial concepts for potential updates focusing on increasing program stringency and supporting a long-term carbon price signal aligned with the state's 2045 climate targets. Review of market rules and cost containment features in the context of allowance budget adjustments to support liquidity, enhance market protections, and ensure transparent pricing. Accounts for the evolution of the electricity sector in the Western US, updates to minimize emissions leakage, and continue to support decarbonization and innovation in California's industrial, manufacturing, and fuel sectors. And updates to offset credit provisions and protocols to streamline implementation and reflect best available science. This slide summarizes cumulative allowance budgets and reductions for allowance budget scenarios discussed in the pre-rulemaking workshops to date. These scenarios reflect greenhouse gas inventory updates and are consistent with the greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets of either 40, 48, or 55% below 1990 levels in 2030. Proposed scenario in the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, assessed allowance budgets consistent with the 48% 2030 target. For the 48% scenario, the cumulative reductions through 2030 are approximately 265 million allowances, and the total 2021 through 2045 cumulative budget is approximately 3,795 million allowances. For the 2021 through 2045 cumulative budgets shown here, the post-2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value that is consistent with the emission reduction target for the scenario to a 2045 cap of 30.3 million allowances. CARB released the SRIA on April 9th. The SRIA represents an initial economic evaluation of potential changes to the program and is prepared using best information available, but may not reflect precise real-world potential impact. CARB emphasizes the SRIA is not a staff proposal for amendments, but is one of many steps CARB must take prior to updating the regulation. This slide illustrates how the SRIA proposed scenario B achieved the cumulative budget and allowance removals for the 48% reduction scenario in annual budgets that can be adopted into the regulation. In the SRIA proposed scenario B, the entire 2021 through 2030 cumulative reduction of 265 million allowances is achieved by removing allowances from the 2025 through 2030 budget years. Then, the post-2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value that is consistent with the 2030 emission reduction target of 173 million metric tons CO2e. This framework results in a significant increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031, and annual budgets remain higher than 2030 through 2033. The outcome of the proposed scenario B is a step increase in the caps from 2030 to 2031. Staff are considering the potential for this increase to impact the post-2030 program and market participants. The increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031 could result in a potential discontinuity in cap adjustment factors and allocation, holding limits, and funds to GDRF. Staff are inviting feedback on how to address this step jump to ensure a steadily increasing price signal while avoiding discontinuities in holding limits, allocation, and allowances that go to auction. I will now pass the presentation to my colleague, Nick Visner, who will present on the program's compliance cost containment measures and proposed market rule concepts.
Thanks, Camille. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Visner. I'm an air pollution specialist with the market monitoring section of the California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade program, and I'll be giving the market rules portion of the presentation today. Market rules ensure transparency and efficiency in the cap and trade market in support of cost-effective GHG emissions reductions. California's cap and trade program became effective on January 1st, 2012, and is over a decade old. CARB has key market administrative responsibilities that include conducting periodic reviews and considering adjustments to the program and its market rules. The current market rules have supported a liquid and well-functioning market with near 100% compliance for regulated entities with a compliance obligation since the program began. At this time, CARB is reevaluating market rules in the context of a maturing market and trends in market activity in the context of a more stringent program with reduced emissions caps. Over the next few slides, I will present the initial staff concepts for potential changes to current market rules for stakeholder feedback and input. CARB is considering the potential impact of removing allowances on market dynamics. Specifically, CARB is reviewing regulatory concepts that can help maintain transparent and steadily increasing efficient carbon price signals for continued investment in GHG reduction technologies. Any adjustments to future allowance budgets will impact trading and banking behavior by market participants. Therefore, CARB staff is evaluating regulatory concepts on allowance holding and market trade rules to support market efficiency, including how to support banking while maintaining market liquidity. Staff is considering concepts related to corporate association rules to avoid coordinated behavior and assessing the automatic holding limit reductions that occur as a result of the proposed changes to future allowance budgets. This review is in the context of continuing to have a well-functioning market that allows for cost-effective compliance with the program. Finally, multi-year compliance periods provide for compliance flexibility and cost optimization to accommodate year-to-year variations in emissions levels. Allowance budget adjustments will affect how a regulated entity chooses to comply with its emissions obligations. Staff is looking to balance the need for compliance flexibility considerations for market participants. CARB staff is also evaluating an adjustment to the length of future compliance periods, primarily to enable the timely assessment of jurisdictional GHG mitigation targets. To set the stage, I'd like to share some staff observations on market participation and allowance holdings. The graph here indicates that in recent years, there's been a steady increase in the number of entities registered in the program. Particularly, there's been an increase in voluntarily associated entities, or as we call them, VAEs. CARB staff observed that the current market offers liquidity. Here, liquidity means ample and easy opportunity to buy or trade allowances, which enhances flexibility for regulated entities to cost-effectively meet compliance obligations. When considering potential concepts for regulatory changes, staff therefore consider how changes to allowance budgets could impact liquidity and how banking and trading can support liquidity. Allowance banking is a key element of the program that supports compliance flexibility, helps to reduce compliance costs for regulated entities, and mitigates volatility in allowance price. Banking also incentivizes regulated entities to make early emissions reductions, and it promotes long-term market efficiency. The graph shows the combined market participant holdings of 2013 and through 2027 vintage allowances in entities' general accounts and their compliance accounts over the past decade. Allowances in compliance accounts will be used to fulfill an entity's compliance obligation and are not available for trade. Allowances in the general account can be banked up to the entity's holding limits and are available at any time for trading or compliance use. The yellow dotted line is a linear regression for aggregated allowance holdings, and it shows an upward trend despite the drops in holdings that correlate to full compliance period compliance events. Another drop is expected for the fourth full compliance period event on November 1st. While banking is an important feature for cost containment and flexibility, staff are monitoring banking to track any impacts to market liquidity. So with this in mind, staff are evaluating initial concepts that address allowance banking and market trade rules that support this primary purpose. We now turn our attention to corporate association groups. Staff are evaluating if the control and ownership measures in the current regulation are adequate to track the types of market participants and corporate structures staff have observed to date. One of the ways that CARB ensures a competitive market is by grouping affiliated entities into corporate association groups, or CAGs. Registered entities that are affiliated with each other are assumed to act in a coordinated fashion in the market. A CAG is made up of a group of separate registered entity accounts that have disclosed a direct corporate association. Each account is operated by a distinct legal entity. Members of a CAG must share a single entity's holding limit and purchase limit. These shares must add to 100%. Therefore, CAG rules limit the market power of a single controlling entity in the market by subjecting the entities with shared control to a shared holding limit and purchase limit. Holding limits and purchase limits must be appropriately applied and enforced to prevent collusive activity. CARB staff has recently observed an increase in account applications for investment funds with various complex corporate structures that the current CAG rules were not designed for, leading staff to consider new ways to monitor various degrees of control and any potential opportunities for coordinated market behavior. Additionally, staff is evaluating the current CAG rules to ensure market integrity in the context of a more stringent future program where fewer allowances will be issued each year. Currently, registered entities must disclose all direct and indirect corporate associations with other registered entities and with unregistered ultimate parent companies. Additionally, registered entities must disclose employees with knowledge of the entity's market position and any contracted cap and trade consultants or advisors. These disclosures ensure that staff can track business relationships and provide proper market oversight. The group of associated entities subject to a CAG is required to share a holding limit and auction purchase limit. Each member is required to identify how those limits will be distributed across the CAG. CARB staff closely oversee market activities and transactions to ensure that these affiliated market participants trade and buy allowances within their applicable limits. Corporate associations are evaluated based on the control and ownership measures that must be disclosed to CARB. There are currently 6 measures of control or ownership. Staff are not considering changes to these 6 measures, but are considering new, additional measures of control or ownership. An additional existing CAG trigger is based on disclosed employees with knowledge of market position. If an individual is disclosed by multiple registered entities as having knowledge of entity-specific market position, then the entities with market position known by the individual are subject to a CAG. This trigger is known as the individual with shared roles test. Cap and trade consultants or advisors who are not an employee of a registered entity, but who have access to market position information are generally exempt from this provision, provided that the consultant or advisory relationship has been disclosed to CARB. With that background, staff is seeking feedback on the following 3 concepts related to the corporate association group rules. First, staff are considering changes to the existing provision on the individual with shared roles test to ensure that individuals who have access to or knowledge of an entity's market position information trigger its CAG as appropriate. This concept would remove the distinction between an employee and a cap and trade consultant or advisor by expanding the current disclosure requirements to include disclosure of any individual with knowledge of or access to market positions. The disclosure requirement would apply to the individual based on their day-to-day roles and responsibilities, regardless of employment or contract status. Additionally, the definition of market position information would be expanded to include knowledge of holding limit or purchase limit values, particularly if an entity is in a CAG and has a percentage share of the maximum holding limit or purchase limit. Under this concept, if an individual account representative or account viewing agent were on multiple registered entity accounts, then the entities would be subject to a CAG regardless of role due to immediate access to specific market position information. This individual could potentially coordinate market activities amongst those accounts, and staff are proposing to safeguard the market against this activity. This concept could include a narrow exemption for certain cap and trade consultants or advisors to exempt them from triggering a CAG if they do not have direct access to the registry account and meet one of 2 conditions. Either 1, they do not have decision-making or legally binding authority over an entity's market position, or 2, They provide cap and trade consulting services only to covered entities. For the second CAG concept, staff are considering a new CAG trigger related to commodity pool operators and commodity trading advisors as defined by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC. Commodity pool operator, or CPO, is an individual or organization that operates a commodity pool and solicits funds for that commodity pool for the purpose of trading futures or options. A commodity trading advisor, or CTA, is an individual or organization that for compensation or profit advises others directly or indirectly as to the value of or the advisability of trading futures contracts, options on futures, or swaps. CPOs and CTAs hold a significant degree of influence and control over the trade decisions and investment strategies of the funds they administer. Under the current regulation, a CPO or a CTA could potentially control the investment strategies and allowance holdings of multiple registered entities in a coordinated manner. Therefore, staff believe that a business relationship between a registered entity and a CPO or CTA results in a level of control over market activities that should be disclosed to ensure future market integrity. For this initial CAG concept, staff are considering using the CPO and CTA definitions from the Code of Federal Regulations to establish a new disclosure requirement for entities. Staff would monitor the use of a CPO or CTA that is registered with the National Futures Association, a self-regulatory organization for the U.S. derivatives industry, designated by the CFTC. A new CAG trigger would be established whereby registered entities that share a common CPO or CTA would be placed in a CAG. Finally, staff are considering a third CAG trigger concept to track control due to selection authority. There would be a new requirement to disclose entities or individuals with selection authority over a registered entity's director or officer, investment manager or advisor, or controlling agent. This disclosure requirement would enable staff to better track corporate relationships and ultimate control. This concept is derived from a 2022 Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, order that identified a disclosable corporate affiliation between an investor and a utility because the investor was able to appoint a board member of the utility. FERC ruled that the investor's appointment ability exerted a sufficient level of control over the utility to deem a corporate affiliation and to require certain reporting. The concept would make selection authority by a common entity a CAG trigger. Staff believes that selecting entities maintain enough control over the registered entities to potentially coordinate market activities. Selection authority could include the authority to hire, appoint, terminate, or control any individual with control over the registered entity, regardless of who the entity with selection authority appoints. The appointed party, such as an investment manager, controlling agent, or director or officer, may be different and is not the CAG trigger. The CAG trigger is the selecting entity. The visual on the bottom is an example of a direct corporate association based on selection authority. The unregistered entity E has the authority to appoint Director A for the registered entity C and Director B for the registered entity D, respectively. Then, a CAG would be established between the registered entity C and the registered entity D because those two entities have a common entity with selection authority, which is unregistered entity E in this case. Please note that this initial concept would not affect general stock shareholders taking actions such as individual acting in corporate elections to elect directors at annual or special meetings of a publicly traded company, except for individual shareholders already tracked and disclosed to CARB due to having voting rights over 10%. Staff recognize that if this 3-item package of CAG rule concepts were adopted, it may cause some entities to be subject both to disclosing a new CAG and be subject to new holding limits. Current CAG disclosure requirements require notifying CARB of a new CAG within 30 days of a change, including new CAG members identifying new holding and purchase limit shares. If these CAG trigger concepts were effective in 2025, immediate implementation and enforcement of CAG triggers could lead to short-term price volatility if allowances were released to the market during a brief period. Staff conservatively estimate that about 30 million allowances may potentially be released to the market upon implementing these 3 new CAG rule concepts. This estimate reflects the minimal market impact scenario where staff assumes that the exemptions described are used to their fullest extent and that existing CAG relationships are maintained. The estimate reflects current corporate disclosures and is based on a recent snapshot in time of allowance holdings. Therefore, staff are considering initial concepts regarding delaying the effective date of the CAG rule changes to mitigate price volatility. 2 timing options being considered for impacted entities are requiring the disclosure of a new CAG within 30 days of the effective date of the regulatory changes, but delaying application of shared holding and purchase limit changes by 1 year, or delaying the effective date of the CAG rules until 2031 at the start of a post-2030 program. CARB is seeking stakeholder feedback on these proposed initial corporate association disclosure and corporate association group concepts. In light of a more stringent program, staff's intent is to update market rules to gather information on evolving business relationships and corporate structures in a manner consistent with federal oversight agencies. Additionally, staff's intent is to avoid unfair market influence and market manipulation through coordinated activities and ensure a cost-effective program for compliance entities. To that end, staff seek feedback with the following questions. Do the proposed CAG rule changes more appropriately capture the different means of control and ownership that exist in the market? Should any changes to the CAG rule be immediate, or should they be phased in over time? If gradual, how long should the delay be, and what factors should be considered? Finally, are there other changes or factors CARB should consider when updating the CAG rules? Next, we will turn our attention to another market rule, the holding limit formula. The holding limit is the maximum number of vintage-specific allowances that may be held by an entity or jointly held by a group of affiliated entities in a CAG. An entity may not hold allowances in its account exceeding their applicable holding limit or holding limit share, or penalties may apply. The holding limit is the same for each entity in each CAG, and it is calculated for each year based on that calendar year's annual allowance budget. As the annual allowance budget decreases, the holding limit also decreases each year. The holding limit applies separately to holdings of current vintage and future vintage allowances. Since the annual allowance budget is the only variable in the holding limit formula, any changes to future allowance budgets will result in changes to the current and future vintage holding limits. The graph on the right shows the current holding limits and the new reduced holding limits under the 48% budget scenario. Assuming no changes to the holding limit formula, the new reduced holding limits will start as soon as the new allowance budgets decrease relative to the budgets in the current regulation. As illustrated in this graph, the increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031 could result in a jump in the holding limit from 2030 to 2031. As discussed in the previous slide, any changes in the future allowance budgets will result in changes in the holding limits based on the current holding limit formula. The table illustrates current holding limits and the new reduced holding limits under the 48% budget scenario for 2025 to 2030 using the current holding limit formula. The more the future annual allowance budgets are decreased, the lower the holding limits become. As the new reduced holding limits will be lower than the current holding limits, an entity may need to dispose of allowances in excess of its holding limit by either selling them or taking advantage of any applicable limited exemption. Based on a recent snapshot of market participant holdings and CAG relationships, CARB staff initially estimate that over 20 million allowances may need to be released into the market due to new reduced holding limits in 2025. This estimate, however, will change over time due to various program dynamics. For example, full compliance period compliance events, auction outcomes, futures and forward contracts, or rulemaking activities can influence entities' trading behaviors and certain investment strategies, resulting in changes to allowance holdings. Next, we turn our attention to adjustment of the length of compliance periods. The purpose of adjusting the length of compliance periods is to enable the timely assessment of jurisdictional GHG mitigation targets by aligning GHG emission target years with the final year of a compliance period. This alignment supports timely application of the accounting mechanism for the net flow of compliance instruments between California, Quebec, and any future potential linkage partners as soon as possible after a jurisdiction's GHG emission target year. The accounting mechanism can only be applied after a full compliance period is complete. Compliance periods are currently triennial, whereby the compliance obligation due at the end of a period is based on the last 3 years of covered emissions. For example, we are currently in the 5th compliance period that started on January 1st, 2024, and will end on December 31st, 2026, with the full compliance period obligations due on November 1st, 2027. In a September 2023 workshop, Quebec staff presented concepts related to modifying the duration of compliance periods to align the last year of a compliance period with years in which there is a GHG emission reduction target, 2030 and 2050. Staff recognizes that compliance periods should continue to align across linked jurisdictions. Therefore, starting compliance period 6, CARB staff are considering 2 concepts related to the duration of compliance periods. Concept 1 would extend compliance period 6 to a longer period of 4 years, ending in 2030, and then establish subsequent 5-year periods ending in 2035, 2040, and 2045. Concept 2 would shorten compliance period 6 to only 2 years, 2027 and 2028, and then establish compliance period 7 as a 2-year period during 2029 and 2030. After 2030, compliance periods would alternate between 3-year and 2-year lengths, ending in 2033, 2035, 2038, 2040, 2043, and 2045. Note that under the 2 proposed scenarios discussed here, the length of compliance period 5 remains the same. CARB is seeking stakeholder feedback on potential changes to compliance period durations, beginning with compliance period 6. Given the potential changes to allowance budgets, staff's intent is to support compliance flexibility for regulated entities to meet their compliance obligations over a multi-year compliance period. Separately, alignment of compliance period end dates with key jurisdiction and state greenhouse gas emission reduction target dates will provide each linked jurisdiction more timely information to account for the implications of the linked programs in meeting its own GHG emissions targets. To that end, staff seek feedback with the following questions. What should the length of compliance periods be for the linked program, considering the time of state and provincial GHG emissions reduction targets relative to other needs? Should all compliance periods have the same duration? Finally, what are the benefits of shorter or longer compliance periods? We'll now move into feedback on allowance budget scenarios and market rules. If you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raised hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button, proceed to introduce yourself, and provide your comment. To accommodate as many people as we can, comments today are limited to 2 minutes and no ceding time to others will be allowed. Please reference the timer on the top right of the slide for your time remaining. As a reminder, stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until May 8th at 11:59 Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. And with that, I will now pass things to my colleague Cypress Figueroa, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your attendance and participation in today's event. We would like to first call on Elizabeth DeJong. Elizabeth, you may now begin giving your comment, please. Oh, looks like we just lost her. Well, Ann McQueen, please unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Good morning. My name is Ann McQueen with York Engineering, and I have a question that's unrelated to today's presentation, but I hope that's okay. On page 11 of the SRIA, there is a statement, CARB staff is also considering a new form of industrial allocation to minimize emissions leakage and incentivize greenhouse gas emissions abatement actions in hard-to-abate sectors. I could not find any reference, any specifics about this in the SRIA or in today's presentation. Can you please explain when this will be disclosed?
Hi, and thanks for the comment. We will be holding additional public discussions after today related to some further topics, including, I anticipate, that topic. We did want to make room for the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to speak today, but we weren't able to address all the topics that were flagged initially in the notice, but we will be discussing those soon. But today we'll focus on the materials that we're presenting. So appreciate your note.
Thank you. We will now hear from Ken Johnson. Ken, please unmute yourself and you may begin your comment.
Yeah, my name is Ken Johnson with Climate Reality Project Silicon Valley chapter. And I just had a question. I think it was back on slide 11. It showed the allowance budget 2021 to 2045 with the discontinuity from 2030 to 2031. I didn't quite understand. Well, first of all, I don't understand why you would want to aim for 48% reduction in 2030 if you're not going to continue that post 2030. And I didn't quite understand why you need to have that discontinuity. It says in the text there, post 2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value. So, I mean, I would think you would just draw a straight line from 2030 without that discontinuity. Could you provide some clarification on that?
Yeah, these are allowance budgets that we had presented in prior workshops. So I believe the slide that you're referring to is the, what was termed the proposed scenario in the SRIA, which was released on April 9th. So that trajectory is aligning with what our scoping plan modeling had indicated would be needed in order to be on the proper path to achieving carbon neutrality and the 85% emission reduction target in 2045. So that's the source of that 48% in 2030 goal. And those allowance removals from 2025 to 2030 are there as one of the options in the SRIA to achieve that. There was some additional thinking presented in workshops, I believe in November of last year, perhaps October, related to the post-2030 allowance budgets. And so that's the source of the kind of discontinuity there. But we would welcome feedback on, part of the reason we're having this discussion here is the impacts that could have on things like GGRF and the holding limits. And so we're welcoming input on thinking around that aspect of the allowance budgets.
Thank you. And next we will hear from Elizabeth De Jong. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hey, thank you. My name is Elizabeth DeYoung. I'm with the Southern California Public Power Authority, or SCAPA, consisting of 12 local publicly owned electric utility members. POUs have successfully implemented the cap and trade program as it is designed to reduce GHG emissions and invest in projects and programs that ultimately lead to further GHG emission reductions. Electric utilities, including POUs, have anchored California's approach to addressing climate change through electrification and renewable energy, and will continue to do so into the future. The approach to date under the program has allowed POUs to make important investments to achieve early decarbonization, and maintaining a consistent approach will allow us to continue making these investments while protecting affordability to support scoping plan objectives. Importantly, changes to POU participation in the cap and trade will impact other sectors. Affordable electricity is critical to the adoption and success of electrifying vehicles and buildings. So in particular, it is important to POUs that we retain allowance allocation and flexibility of using those allowances to continue creating the positive impacts we've had thus far. In the last rulemaking, CARB set fixed allowance allocation for POUs for 2021 to 2030, with those allowances significantly reducing over the decade. CARB acknowledged the need for fixed allowance allocations for utilities, specifically to incentivize early voluntary actions to reduce GHG emissions. SCAPA members supported the cap and trade program by making significant investments, and we want to ensure that those early actions are not undercut by reductions to allowance allocation for POUs. So we urge you to take into consideration the unique and pivotal role that POUs play in successfully achieving the state's GHG emissions reductions and carbon neutrality goals towards reaching that 2022 scoping plan. SCAPA will be submitting further details in written comments, answering more directly some of the information and questions that were raised today. But I want to thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you for that, and appreciate the comments and look forward to reviewing your written comments. I believe you've submitted similar comments to that in the past, but we'll look forward to further evolution there and appreciate your input.
Thank you. We will now hear from Joey Hoekstra. Joey, please unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hello, I'm Joey Hoekstra. I'm with the International Emissions Trading Association. We've been following this rulemaking closely, and we've submitted many comments in the past, and we plan on continuing submitting comments. I was just wanting to ask CARB staff, hoping to see if there's any further clarification on the pools of allowances that they are proposing to remove allowances from to achieve the 2030 target. These slides don't mention any specific pools, so I'm just wondering if there's additional thinking from CARB on where these allowances are going to be removed from. Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. We don't have any information to share at this time. As I indicated, we will be having additional public discussions coming up in the next weeks and months. So we anticipating having discussions about that topic during those conversations.
Thank you. It looks like we currently have 2 hands raised. We will now hear from Jeff Wilkerson. Jeff, please unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Thank you. I have a question on slide 7 around the fuel sector. At a workshop in October, CARB discussed compliance obligations of biofuels. I'm wondering if staff is still considering no longer exempting some biofuels.
So this is Rajinder. We've had a longstanding position in the cap and trade program that eligible biomass derived energy is exempt in the program. And so the idea about biofuels is thinking about the new kinds of fuels coming on like SAF and some of the renewable diesel. it's not really a conversation about exemptions or it's not a conversation about applying a compliance obligation where there wasn't one in the past.
Thank you. We will now hear from Nicholas Roy. Nicholas, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Nicholas Roy. I'm a research associate at Resources for the Future. I just wanted to ask why, just better understand the budget choice or the allowance budget choice that includes the discontinuity that was presented at the beginning of this presentation. Earlier in the workshops last year, CARB was considering budgets that did not have this rise in the budget in 2031. And the first commenter today already noted that this can be a bit confusing without a clear communication about the motivation behind the budget reductions for the next half of this decade. And an obvious thing would be to avoid the difficulties of all the transition considerations that are described in this call would be to opt for the other budgets that did not have this discontinuity. So I just want to understand better why these budgets that have a rise in 2031 were chosen over the others that were linearly declined from the budget level in 2030 instead of the target level. Thank you.
Sure, and this is Rajendra, I can speak to that. I think one of the things is that we're trying to use the target years 2030, 2045, and the statutory targets for 2030 and 2045 as the anchors for what that allocation and those allowance budgets could look like. Certainly you could continue a linear decline, but that would be more aggressive than actually respecting the targets in statute. And so what we're doing in this presentation is looking at a 2031 starting budget that aligns with the statutory target and then taking that out to the statutory target in 2045. It's already going to be ambitious enough without having to add additional ambition beyond what's in statute. Obviously, if new statutes came into force, we would want to reflect that, but that 2031 to 2045 reflects the statutes that are in place right now.
Thank you. We will now hear from Nicole Hughes. Nicole, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, good morning. My name is Nicole Hughes. I am a regulatory policy analyst for the Public Generating Pool, which is a trade association representing consumer-owned utilities in Washington and Oregon. My question is in relation to the sort of glide path of this rulemaking with respect to the potential for linkage with the Washington market. I know that last month, California, Quebec, and Washington issued a joint statement kind of formally expressing that interest in linkage. Though I know that CARB staff has previously indicated in this workshop series that these rulemakings under consideration are not at this time kind of looking through the lens of linkage. So I was just curious if you can speak to the relationship at this point in time between this rulemaking and the linkage processes. Because I know, just for example, these budget and market rules are categories of rules that will need to be substantively similar, if not identical, between the markets, and ecology is now engaging in a linkage rulemaking itself. So I'm just kind of wondering what the interrelationships between these rulemakings are at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the interest. This rulemaking that we are contemplating right now will not reflect linkage with the state of Washington program. So want to be clear about that. We know that there's a ballot measure to be negotiated in November in Washington related to their program. We have been, however, coordinating with them and are aware of the status of their program and elements that would be needed for linkage. We did have that announcement about a month ago related to interest and in a potential linkage. So that is out there, but it will not be an aspect of this rulemaking. For the California cap and trade to link with any program does require a formal rulemaking process. That means notice of the rule, changes to a regulation, public discussion, and adoption by our board. Also leading up to that, there are certain statutory findings that our governor's office must make under SB 1018, in addition to linkage package developed by the staff at our agency. So there are many steps that need to happen before any linkage. Those would be subsequent to this current rulemaking that we're contemplating for this year.
Thank you. At this time, we currently have no hands raised. So if you would like to give a comment, please raise your hand and we will comment, or we will give you an opportunity to comment. If not, we will go ahead and move forward with our presentation. So please raise your hand if you'd like to give a comment. If not, please submit your written comments.
Cypress?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I clarify something on one of the previous questions that was asked about the transition from 2030 to 2031. For clarification, that 2031 is built off of the 48% from the scoping plan, not the 40% in the SB 32 target. But again, the point is that there are two anchor points in that 2031 to 2045 profile, and they're informed by work that we've done or statutes, and that's why you see that kink in the transition there.
Hello, welcome back from the stretch break, rejoining California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade Program pre-rulemaking workshop. Again, we're presenting some initial concepts today to solicit some feedback from you all. In the second half of the workshop today, we want to present on some initial concepts and initial thinking related to the compliance offsets program. So that includes some of the offset protocols and some of the aspects in the cap and trade regulation itself. I'm going to turn it over to Steve and Shelby for the first part of the presentation, and later Nora Kennedy will present on aspects of the cap and trade regulation. Stephen's going to cover a few initial concepts related to some of the offset protocols that we have. So Stephen, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I am Stephen Shelby, and I'm an air pollution specialist working to help implement the compliance offset program. So today we will be discussing potential updates to cap and trade's compliance offset program. We will cover initial concepts for amending offset-related regulatory requirements and for updating 3 of the existing protocols, including the livestock protocol, the mine methane capture protocol, and ozone depleting substances destruction protocol. Updates to CARB's current U.S. forest, urban forest, and rice cultivation offset protocols are not part of this current rulemaking effort. However, there are some initial concepts related to forest projects provisions in the cap and trade regulation. These initial concepts are based on implementation to date and aim to improve, clarify, and streamline requirements. What are compliance offset credits? CARB issued offset credits represent a GHG emission reduction or GHG removal enhancement of 1 metric ton carbon dioxide equivalent. Compliance credits are generated only from projects at non-cap sources that meet the requirements in one of the 6 board-adopted protocols and the requirements of the cap and trade regulation. Credits are issued for GHG reductions or removals that meet the AB 32 criteria of being real, additional, quantifiable, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable by the state board. Offset credits provide an important cost containment mechanism within the overall cap and trade program via offset projects which achieve cost-effective emission reductions while providing environmental and other co-benefits. Credits may be used to meet a limited portion of covered entities' compliance obligations. The compliance offset program also helps direct private funding to activities that reduce GHGs, such as nature-based activities. Pursuant to AB 398, an entity may use offset credits for up to 4% of its cap and trade program compliance obligation for emissions during 2021 through 2025, and for up to 6% of its obligation for emissions in 2026 and beyond. Pursuant to AB 398, no more than 1/2 of the quantitative usage limit may be sourced from projects that do not provide direct environmental benefits to the state of California, specifically to California's air quality and water quality. As of the last issuance on April 9th, the total offset credits issued with a DEBS designation is over 63 million, nearly 1/4 of the total offset credits issued. The mine methane capture protocol provides methods to quantify GHG emissions reductions associated with the capture and destruction of methane that would otherwise be vented into the atmosphere as a result of mining operations at active underground and surface and coal and trona mines and abandoned underground coal mines. The mine methane capture protocol focuses on quantifying the change in methane emissions, but also accounts for effects on carbon dioxide emissions. Staff initial concepts for updating this protocol include minor clarifications and updates to existing requirements. First, we are looking to update default EPA emission factors for CO2, carbon dioxide, and eGrid, annual output emission rates, to be consistent with the most recent published factors. Staff is also considering setting the eligibility for a source test for 2 years. Currently, the protocol does not require any updates for a source test, but an engine's destruction efficiency is expected to change over time. Over the last several years of implementation, CARB staff have received many questions about potentially splitting the decline curve among multiple projects. To our knowledge, there is no established method for doing so, and sharing a decline curve has never been allowed. Because the question has arisen several times, we want to make it explicit within the protocol that a decline curve cannot be split. Similarly, we want to be explicit that the Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA, ID number may not be used for more than one abandoned mine project. The MSHA ID is specific to the mine, and so if an MSHA ID is associated with a project, that mine has a decline curve associated with it. Because there is no way to split a decline curve, there cannot be more than one project at that mine, and thus only one MSHA ID. These are our initial thoughts on updates, and we are open to suggestions on these or any other ideas you might have. The compliance offset protocol for livestock projects provides methods to quantify and report GHG emission reductions associated with the installation of a biogas control system for manure management on dairy cattle and swine farms. Staff's initial thinking for the livestock protocol updates also consist of minor clarifications and updates. The first 2 bullets on this slide mirror those on the previous slide. We are looking to update the EPA emission factors and to set a 2-year eligibility for source tests. Currently, the livestock protocol does not define a destruction temperature for a flare, so we are considering to set the minimum temperature at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The current protocol does not include use of a weeping wall. We are considering adding a weeping wall solid separation fraction of 0.5 to table A9 of the livestock protocol. We are also aiming to correct some typographical errors throughout the protocol. Once again, these are staff's initial thoughts on updates for this protocol, and we are open to suggestions on these or any other ideas you might have. The ozone depleting substances, or ODS protocol, provides methods to quantify and report greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with the destruction of high global warming potential ozone depleting substances sourced from and destroyed within the US that would have otherwise been released to the atmosphere. The project category includes ODS used in foam blowing agent and refrigerant applications. Staff are considering several updates to the ODS protocol. This slide highlights 5 primary areas where staff believe the protocol where updates may be needed. First, we are considering expanding the list of eligible ODS refrigerants. Several refrigerants now are no longer allowed to be manufactured or imported into the United States and may benefit from being added as eligible under our protocol. Second, emission factors and other parameters change over time as science advances. Staff is reviewing whether updates to emission factors and other parameters in Appendix B are appropriate and appreciate input on the best science and sources for these factors. Third, staff is considering removing the prohibition on refrigerants sourced from US federal government facilities. 15 years ago, it was considered common practice for the federal government to destroy these older refrigerants. We need to reevaluate if this is still the case or if destruction is no longer common. Fourth, staff is considering an update to how the point of origin for ODS is determined. Project developers are required to have chain of custody information for refrigerants back to the point of origin. Entities verified to be in the chain of custody are included in offset project data reports. Currently, the threshold to be considered the point of origin is 500 pounds. Staff are evaluating if this is still the appropriate threshold. Staff is also evaluating how shipments that in total exceed 500 pounds but have less than 500 pounds included within a given project should be treated. Fifth, CARB staff would like to update project listing and reporting requirements to improve public transparency. This may mean more detailed reporting about the role of each entity in the custody chain. How contact information is reported for each entity in the custody chain may also be improved. CARB's ODS protocol has different subtypes. To date, all projects implemented have been refrigerant projects. The protocol also provides for foam project. CARB is also considering a few updates to provision related to foam projects to remove barriers to developing projects. The initial concepts include updating the project baseline calculation, the prescribed foam handling procedure, and other updates which the American Carbon Registry implemented in its protocol. For the baseline, the Offset Protocol Task Force recommended changing the baseline from the existing protocol, which assumes long-term disposal in landfill with very little loss to the atmosphere, to what is the current practice of recovery and reuse with a much higher rate of loss to the atmosphere. In the 2014 ODS protocol, CARB did remove references to landfill, but given the recommendations from the Offset Protocol Task Force, further clarification or revision may be warranted. CARB also invites stakeholders to comment on which updates included in the American Carbon Registry's version 2.0 ODS protocol CARB should consider including in the CARB ODS protocol. A brief update on the U.S. Forest Projects Compliance Offset Protocol. CARB staff has been working with researchers to update the wildfire and natural disturbance risk ratings, including improvements to the risk rating methodology to include in the next version of the Forest Protocol. The updated risk rating methodology will incorporate the latest science on wildfire and natural disturbance probability across the United States, and the expected changes in occurrence and severity due to climate change. Updates to the U.S. Forest Protocol are not part of the current planned rulemaking, but CARB staff intend to propose updates to the Forest Protocol soon after the research contract is complete and the new information is available. For more information on CARB's process to update the U.S. Forest Protocol, please see the November 2022 materials for the Forest Protocol workshop on the Cap and Trade website. Staff welcome stakeholder feedback on potential updates to these 3 compliance offset protocols. Next, my colleague Nora Kennedy will discuss initial concepts for changes to the cap and trade regulation related to the compliance offset program.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm a staff air pollution specialist with the Compliance Offset Program. Staff believes the process for renewing crediting periods can be improved. The current regulation identifies that a renewal application must be submitted between 9 and 18 months before the end of the final reporting period of the initial crediting period. Early program experience indicates this is too early for many project developers. Previous regulatory amendments provided project developers flexibility on the length of the final reporting period in their initial crediting period. This means it is hard to know when the current window exists since it is tied to a date that is subject to change. Tying the renewal window to a fixed date would provide greater certainty for project developers. Another important need is to clarify the process for a project developer to petition CARB regarding the verifiability of an offset project data report. CARB staff are considering incorporating current guidance into regulatory language. Under current guidance, after an OPDR petition is made by the project developer, the verification body may not submit its offset verification statement and detailed verification report until after CARB has determined the OPDR is verifiable. The verification body has a 15-day deadline to submit the verification statement and report to the registry. At this point, the process returns to the regular process for review by the registry for potential issuance of registry offset credits. Related to conflict of interest requirements for verification bodies, CARB staff are primarily considering regulatory amendments to clarify existing program requirements. Corporate affiliations can lead to conflict of interest, and many corporations are affiliated in this area. The current regulation specifies that some affiliations must be evaluated as part of a conflict of interest evaluation. Staff thinks additional affiliations are also important to include and consider and are proposing to add conflict of interest evaluations related to the offset project operator, authorized project designee, and/or technical consultants. In addition, CARB's current rules require all prior verification work with the project developer, including its project consultants, to be disclosed. Prior verification work does not constitute a conflict of interest, so the requirement to disclose such work may be unnecessary, and we are considering removing that requirement. Finally, for verifications that reduce the invalidation period of one or more previous reporting periods, the current regulatory language specifies that the verification must be done by a verification body that is different from earlier verifications. Staff are considering clarifying that this requirement extends to all individual verification team members, not just the verification body. We are also seeking input on offset project registry requirements. The cap and trade regulation enables CARB-approved offset project registries to help administer parts of the compliance offset program. Offset project registries help facilitate the listing, reporting, and verification of offset projects that are developed using CARB's compliance offset protocols. They also issue registry offset credits. The current regulation specifies that project and verification documents become publicly available within 10 working days of the registry issuing registry offset credits. But the regulation is silent on the public availability of information when credits are not issued after verification, such as after a verification of a forest project reversal. We are considering adding language related to how information becomes publicly available after a verification that does not result in offset credit issuance during a project's crediting period. We are also considering clarifying what information should be reviewed by the registries and made public after a forest project enters its monitoring phase, which is after the project's crediting period when no offset credits will be issued. We are also considering adding a requirement for registries to notify CARB of any missed deadlines for active projects to ensure timely enforcement action by CARB when appropriate. I will now present initial concepts for the cap and trade regulation provisions related to the U.S. forest offset projects. As previously noted, we are not updating the U.S. Forest Protocol during this rulemaking. The protocol will be updated when needed information becomes available. These slides discuss provisions within the cap and trade regulation itself. The first set of initial concepts is related to forest project reversals. Specifically, we are considering clarification of a few existing definitions in the regulation and provisions. The unintentional reversal definition could be clarified to include response to fire actions and prescribed fire. Additionally, we are looking at amending the forest offset reversal provisions to clarify the discovery date of unintentional reversals and the first occurrence date of intentional reversals. These changes aim to provide clarity to offset project operators and verification bodies on the timing for submitting offset project data reports and verification documents. Related to unintentional reversals, CARB is also considering clarifying reporting requirements, including clarifying that an offset project data report is required to be submitted after an unintentional reversal. The current regulation text about providing a verified estimate of carbon stocks is unclear about whether an offset project data report must be submitted. The current regulation does not address monitoring period requirements. Staff recognizes that requirements during the monitoring period may need to differ from those during a crediting period. We are considering adding new regulatory text specifying that any reversal is not required to be compensated by the forest owner or the forest buffer account if the reversal occurs during the 100-year monitoring period and the residual on-site carbon stocks are maintained at a level above the carbon stocks in the final credited reporting period. This provision is necessary to ensure all credited on-site stocks are permanently maintained by the forest owner. We are considering adding regulatory text to section 95983 to clarify forest project termination requirements. Staff's initial thinking is to require a confidence buffer to be applied to the assessment of current standing live carbon stocks relative to baseline standing live carbon stocks. This confidence buffer would work similarly to the confidence deduction used in crediting, but would be added to the total current standing live stocks when determining whether the project terminates. This change is potentially necessary to ensure CARB estimates are conservative and based on the current inventory's sampling error. CARB is also considering eliminating the automatic termination language for unintentional reversals in section 95983D, which states that a project is terminated if the project's standing live carbon stocks fall below its baseline. Instead, CARB could provide an option for a forest project owner to continue the project even if the standing live carbon stocks dipped below the baseline. These options could include allowing minimal monitoring, reporting, and verification until carbon stocks have grown back above the baseline, or voluntary termination, either immediately or at some designated time in the future. This change would offer flexibility to a forest owner if an unintentional reversal lowered the project's standing live carbon stocks just below the project baseline. This would allow the forest owner to resume crediting and continue the project once the project's standing live carbon stocks rebounded. CARB is seeking input on adding and updating definitions related to forest offset projects in section 95802. The new definitions could include response to wildfire and correctable error, and definition modifications could also include changes to the existing definition of conservative. These terms are currently used within the cap and trade regulation, and by defining them, CARB would aim to give clarity to program participants. CARB is also considering adding a new type of offset verification statement opinion for cases where the data in an offset project data report is accurate and complete, but for some reason, the project cannot be credited. Currently, the forest program is designed to have a verifier review and issue a positive offset verification statement if they concur with the estimates and findings presented in the offset project data report, or an adverse offset statement if they do not concur. For forest projects, only after receiving a positive offset verification statement can the project operator or authorized project designee request credits from CARB. There are situations where the offset project data report may be correct, but the project is ineligible to receive credits for that reporting period. This can happen with projects that have had non-compliance violations or a missed reporting deadline. In this case, neither a positive nor an adverse statement is applicable, as a positive statement leads to offset crediting. This new verification opinion could provide transparency to the public in situations where all project data are accurate, but the verification does not lead to crediting. To accompany this new type of verification statement opinion, CARB staff would also add a description of its applicability to section 95977.1 of the cap and trade regulation. CARB is considering adding amendments to expand and strengthen verification services for U.S. forest offset projects. We are looking to clarify requirements during the post-crediting monitoring period. Currently, the regulation states that receiving adverse statements on 2 consecutive offset verifications during the monitoring period leads to an intentional reversal. CARB is considering modifying section 95977 to specify that sequestration projects receiving adverse offset verification statements on 2 consecutive verified reporting periods during the monitoring period will trigger project termination. This new section would increase stringency during a forest project's 100-year monitoring period after the crediting period. It would also ensure greater adherence to reporting for the project life and align with the regulatory amendment to the intentional reversal definition that is under consideration. Next, CARB is requesting feedback as to whether there is a need to safeguard against verification body shopping. This may happen during verification if the offset project operator is displeased with the outcome and seeks a verification body that will provide a different outcome. We are looking for feedback on ways in which offset project operators or authorized project designees' perceived influence on verification bodies can be reduced. Some ideas may include rotating verifiers more frequently, restricting how rotations occur, separating the payment stream to bolster independence between the offset project operator and verification body, or developing a verification body selection process. Lastly, CARB would like to clarify site visit requirements for forest project verifications. CARB is proposing to modify section 95978 to clarify the CARB accredited offset verifier must be within 4 hours of technical experts only during a site visit, defined as being in proximity by telephone and being able to drive to the project location within 4 hours. This modification is necessary to provide clarity to CARB accredited verification bodies of team requirements during site visit verifications. CARB is considering amending the regulation to standardize the project ownership transfer process. The addition of this section ensures that any new forest owner is informed of and prepared to meet the legal and financial responsibilities and commitments of the forest project, so that project terminations are either avoided or occur at the appropriate time and are applied to the appropriate entity. The regulation currently requires a listing form as the first step in the development of a forest project. But when land ownership changes during the project's lifetime, there's a need to specify what, how, and when ownership information must be submitted to CARB and the offset project registry, and what the implications are for missing any submission deadlines. Staff are also considering adding a requirement that the current landowner must provide a full, transparent disclosure to the new landowner so that they are aware of the project's existence and about requirements related to reporting, verification, monitoring, and permanence. The amendments may include specifying the legal and financial documents associated with the forest carbon project to be given to the new forest owner, the procedure to inform registries and CARB of the pending sale of the forest project, and clarifications to the required documentation, deadlines, penalties, and other requirements when a transfer or sale of project land occurs. CARB is also considering amendments to Section 95975 to state that a new offset project operator may relist a previously terminated project. This section currently states that a new project may only occur on land that was previously listed with a forest project if the previous project was terminated due to an unintentional reversal. CARB proposes to provide flexibility to new owners who want to continue a project that was terminated as a result of the previous owner's failure to meet OPO transfer requirements and/or the new ownership transfer process. This brings us to the final slide on topics of regulatory amendments for the Compliance Offset Program. CARB is considering amending Section 95989 to add a new requirement for direct environmental benefits to California. The current regulation establishes direct environmental benefit status for the project life. The new subsection will require verification of activity-based DEBS determination for forest projects outside of California during each full verification. This new section is necessary to confirm that projects are following through on commitments they have made that are crucial to providing environmental benefits to California. Staff is proposing to remove provisions related to early action offset credits, specifically the provisions on invalidation in Section 95985. We anticipate the 8-year invalidation window to have passed for all early action offset credits by the time the regulation is brought to CARB's board. CARB is also proposing to modify the invalidation timeframe. Currently, the invalidation timeframe starts at the end of the reporting period. Since the verification is not considered complete until after RBOCs are issued, staff proposes the invalidation timeframe to begin at the date of CARB issuance. Finally, CARB is considering amendments to the cap and trade regulation to allow baseline adjustment when a later verification finds an error greater than 5%, or when an error is discovered in calculations of carbon estimates for forest projects. This change would allow the project to correct errors that are discovered in later verifications and confirm that baseline calculations are consistent with project calculations. Currently, this language is included only in the 2015 Forest Protocol, and this amendment would apply this concept to forest projects under all forest protocols. This concludes staff's initial concepts for updating the general provisions in the cap and trade regulation related to offset credits. This presentation touched on a lot of initial concepts. As a summary, CARB is considering amending and improving upon the timing and process of renewed crediting periods and adverse offset verification statement petitions, conflict of interest requirements for verification bodies, offset project registry requirements, forest project reversals and termination, forest project definitions, verification requirements for forest projects, forest offset project land transfers, direct environmental benefits verification, removing early action provisions, and forest baseline adjustments. CARB would appreciate any comments you can provide on these initial concepts, as well as any additional concepts that you would like CARB to consider. We'll now move on to feedback on compliance offset program topics. If you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button. Proceed to introduce yourself and provide your comment. To accommodate as many people as we can, comments today are limited to 2 minutes, and please no ceding time to others. Please reference the timer on the top right of the slide for the time remaining. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until May 8th. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. With that, I will now pass things to my colleague Cypress, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Thank you, Nora. Okay. All right. Okay, it looks like we do have one hand raised currently. So Edward Murphy, please unmute yourself and you may begin your comment. Edward Murphy, you're unmuted. Please begin your comment.
Sorry, I didn't see the button.
No problem.
Just had one quick question. Does the CARB staff have any expected date as to when the full forest protocol might be open for the same level of discussion as the other protocols discussed today?
Thanks, Ed. It will be, I believe Stephen presented one slide related to the research contract that we have underway for related to risk ratings and how those might be evolving due to climate change and other factors. We are actively working with the contractor to move that forward, but we need that information before we can proceed with that. So it won't be part of this rulemaking, but I anticipate, as soon as we can, once we get all the information available, we would be having that discussion.
Thank you. We will now hear from John Constantino. John, please unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So John Constantino on behalf of the Verified Emission Reduction Association, which is the offset developers for most of the offsets used in California. Certainly appreciate CARB's continued support of offsets. The highlight to cost containment is certainly an important one, but the impact the offsets provide for natural and working lands and getting to the goals of the state are important as well. So we don't want to forget those. And the co-benefits that offsets provide, water quality and other such things, we want to make sure that those are recognized as well. Vera supports improvements in the protocols. We support additional transparency and clarity associated with the offset program and look forward to working with CARB on these potential changes. I will note that there was a whole lot of material suggested to be changed, definitions, concepts, and you really can't comment on those in detail unless you see some words on paper. So we'll certainly submit comments by the May 8th deadline. We'll submit comments on the concepts, but really look forward to talking in more detail, seeing actual red line strikeout so that we can determine if those improvements make sense and if we can help make them even better. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And again, May 8th is the written comment deadline. Understand that there's a lot covered here, but what we're doing is trying to scope out the areas where we see potential for improvement and provide some initial thinking there. And we will continue conversations to get as we home in on more detailed information. But hopefully there's enough here for you to consider comments and feedback to us. Thanks.
Thank you. We will now hear from Christopher Douglas. Christopher, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Christopher Douglas, Environmental Investigation Agency. We've been working on ODS and HFCs among our climate campaign for the last 3 decades. There are fundamental issues when it comes to additionality, especially for expanding the eligible credits to other ODS like HCFC 22, or especially HFCs, which are still in production. Any destruction is not necessarily additional if these emission reductions or if those HFCs could instead be reused and offset virgin production. There's a similar argument for HCFC 22. This gas is still used as a feedstock and widely produced in the US. So in other words, destroying that HCFC 22 could lead to more emissions due to more production for that feedstock use. So we would have serious concerns with expanding the ODS offset destruction credits, setting aside the fact that most of those are not actually ODS and are still in production. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. And we do take additionality seriously and welcome your comments related to the issues that you raised. To the extent that you do have data, specific data and additional information, really appreciate that for informing our process as well.
Okay, we currently have one hand raised from Edward Murphy. Edward, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Yeah, I apologize. As just a follow-up to the point about the waiting for the contract on adjusting the factors related to fire and future risks, or in terms of fire, is that contractor also going to be considering not just climate change, but also the significant statewide multi-owner, multi-agency work on fuel break construction and reduction of fire risk as well? It would be it would almost obviate the requirement to start over again if those efforts are complete and as planned to achieve much lower fire risk than climate change would indicate to be higher.
Yeah, hi Ed. This is Shelby Livingston. I'm the manager of the offset section. And so yes, your point on all the efforts that are going on in California is definitely noted. One of the things about the contract that we're having to really be, they are having to look nationwide, right? So to the extent to which they can get very specific on different actions that are happening within any given state are somewhat limited. It's going to be a little bit higher level to some extent. In terms of the timing of the contract, once that contract is over, we're going to have to digest and figure out kind of how to integrate into the protocol itself and how that's all going to work. And so we're looking at a couple years before we start really delving into kind of the specifics of a protocol update. So did that answer your questions?
I don't know if I'm still muted or not, but no, that's fine. I understand the specificity. It's just that in particular, when you have a DEBS project in California that is now surrounded by state and federal fuel breaks and private fuel breaks, that applying some new factor that doesn't take that into account would not be very helpful.
Well, and let me just be clear. So the contractors aren't looking at specific activities like projects that are on the ground, right? But the work itself is definitely looking at fuels treatments and the impact of those treatments on risk. So maybe that'll helps clarify, right? So it's not like the specific project that like CAL FIRE is doing, or any other agency, federal or state. Rather, it's assessing looking at how to assess the impact of those fuel breaks on risk, so that we are taking those activities into account, and potentially, if those activities are being done, that would then lower the risk for the project, and that would be factored into their risk rating.
And Ed, to the extent that you can put any of your feedback in writing and submit that to us, it's certainly something that we can consider your feedback in addition to the work that the contractor is doing for us. So look forward to getting that from you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Michael Scavarla. Michael, please unmute yourself and begin.
Yeah, this is Mikhail Savarla. I'm here on behalf of the California Forest Carbon Coalition. Wanted just kind of following up on what Mark stated. Is feedback kind of welcome to inform this, and will there be a separate kind of workshop on these potential improvements once the contractor's work is complete?
Yeah, we are welcoming feedback. Again, that contractor work relates specifically to the forest offset protocol, which is not part of this contemplated rulemaking that we're doing this year. So we're awaiting that work for the contractor, but certainly there will be any additional information that can be provided in the interim, we can consider. So more opportunities for discussion on the forest offset protocol, for sure.
Thank you. We will now hear from Rich Blostein. Rich, please unmute yourself and begin.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Rich Blostein. I'm a journalist. I write for Climate Brief. A quick question, something that came up at a recent EJAC meeting where you have a party that reacquires land and wants to opt out of a cap and trade arrangement. I gathered from today's session, there was mentioning of mechanism to opt in for a new landowner, but how about opt out? Thank you.
So, sorry, this is Shelby. I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah. Okay, yes. So currently that there actually is an option to opt out. And so that's currently available and will remain available. There's a requirement to maintain carbon for 100 years. But if you want to voluntarily terminate your project, there's a penalty. You have to pay back all of the credits that you have been issued plus a penalty. But that option is already available.
And to clarify, each project does have a permanence requirement. So opting out entails not following through on that permanence requirement, which is where the penalties come in. So any opt-out would be associated with penalties, I believe would be the correct understanding right now.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Ben Apple. Ben, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello, this is Ben Apple with Environmental Commodities Corporation. First, I would like to thank ARB staff for making these topics so accessible and for your very thorough and informative slides. They make it easy for project developers to follow along and anticipate changes. So thank you very much. My question is regards to update of default EPA emission factor values, which I note are under consideration. And I wonder if there's also consideration of updating the global warming potential of methane, which is published in the same EPA database. Thank you.
I think this is an area where we can welcome input. There would be impacts across programs at CARB, and this is something that we need to consider kind of at a holistic level. So a change in one place can have impacts broadly that we would need to kind of consider thoroughly.
So Mark, this is Rajinder. I'll just say, so you got that. Like when we change from one assessment to another for the IPCC global warming potentials, we look at it for moving all of our programs that rely on those global warming potentials to happen about the same time. Cap and trade is also linked with Quebec, so we'd want to make sure that we coordinated with Quebec. But we are aware that the methane values are higher in the more recent assessments.
Thank you. At this time, we currently have no hands raised, so I would like to do a last call for any comments. Please raise your hand. If not, please please submit your comments on the web page. Oh, okay. We have one commenter, Myra Cruz. Myra, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, I'm Myra Cruz from Opus. I have more of a general question. I'm just wondering, in general, CARB staff, how many more steps does the agency need to go through before finalizing the amendments to the cap and trade program? That's it.
Yeah, this is Rajinder. So you know that we submitted the SURIA for 60 days. We cannot put out any 45-day packages. And we did have to shorten the slide deck for today. So we do need to get in one more workshop to talk specifically about allocation. And then we would be putting out a 45-day package this summer for public comment and making it back to the board this year for a board vote.
Thank you, Rajinder. We have one comment from Kevin Hamilton. Kevin, please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Kevin Hamilton from Central California Asthma Collaborative. I want to thank staff again today for putting together this package. I know what an amazing and hard lift this whole thing must be. So I just want to be sure I offer that thanks. And I was really pleased to hear of some of the changes that we're looking at, especially shortened timelines for expiration of credits. So starting to feel a little bit positive about what might happen here for this particular version of the scoping plan. But again, I just want to reiterate that we need to be more strict in this program on who is actually following the program and who is not and just using it. So we need a tool, we need a way to be able to find that out. And when we identify it, those entities should not be allowed to continue participating in this really amazing program and gain its benefits. So I really see it's the tale of two programs, and it needs to be moved in that direction. And I'm not seeing that from this presentation right now. I see gradual movement, but still sort of massaging it. So I think we have to think bigger than that. But again, thank you very much for this today. Really appreciate all the hard work everybody's done. Looking forward.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you staying with us for the last few hours and jumping back on to share that. I will just say that there are slides that go back over the last year that speak to some of the points that you are making, such as tightening the program. And we've seen prices increasing in the program, and that gets to, raising the floor price in the program. In the SURIA, we do talk about the 3 asks that were made at that public engagement meeting, and would welcome further thoughts on some of the considerations we laid out on that piece. I will say that in one of the slides that we saw here today, you had, a 3% cap decline for industry. I want to make sure that everyone that's read the SURIA realizes that your slide had 3%. The current annual cap decline is 4%, and the SURIA is actually calling for 8%, around 8%. And so I think there's probably some updated information that you haven't been able to find time in your very busy schedule with your normal job to see in the SURIA. But I believe that at the next EJAC meeting in May, we will be giving an update on the SURIA and some of the discussion that we have in there that will be responsive to some of the points that you raise. Thank you.
At this time, we have no hands raised currently, so I will thank you all for your participation and pass it back to Mark.
Thanks, Cypress, and also just want to echo Rajinder's comments and extend my appreciation to Kevin for showing up and sharing his views earlier and sticking with us throughout the workshop. We are coming to a close. The final slide here just has some links to some CARB staff assessments that we have posted to our webpage over time, related to some ongoing conversations among the cap and trade program and local air pollution. We have an assessment of the banked allowance supply and some information on the forest offset protocol. We've done all of these evaluations, posted them on the webpage so that they're publicly available, as well as the cap and trade website at large, which includes a host of information, background about how the program works, and regular updates about the operation of the market, including who's registered in the program, the types of allowances transfers that are happening, the auctions. So encourage folks to continue to gain familiarity and fluency in the program by clicking through on those CARB staff assessments and the webpage in general. For next steps, I'm going to wrap up, but we have a couple weeks for you to submit comments through May 8th, midnight. The link for the